Greenland isn't a joke, a headline stunt, or a billionaire's fantasy purchase. It's the most important piece of territory Americans aren't paying attention to, and that ignorance is dangerous. While people argue about personalities and politics, the foundations of military power, technology dominance, and global trade are quietly shifting north into the Arctic. This is not about land, it's about leverage. Right now, the United States is exposed in ways most people don't understand. Its most advanced weapons rely on materials processed almost entirely by China. Its future trade routes are forming in waters it doesn't control. Its missile defense and early warning systems depend on access granted by another country's permission. That combination is not sustainable. It's a countdown. Greenland sits at the exact intersection of all three vulnerabilities, and that makes it priceless. Not symbolically, but mathematically. Over the next few decades, control over rare earth supply chains, Arctic shipping lanes, and northern military positioning will determine which nations can project power and which are forced to react. Greenland is the hinge point. Once you understand that, the question stops being whether America wants Greenland and becomes whether it can afford not to secure it. The answer is no. And once a superpower reaches that conclusion, outcomes stop being optional and start becoming inevitable. The rare earth issue alone makes Greenland unavoidable, because modern power is no longer defined by oil fields or steel output, but by control over materials most people never think about. Rare earth elements sit at the heart of advanced military systems and next-generation technology, and without them, industrial capacity collapses quietly but completely. China understood this decades ago and made a deliberate choice to dominate processing rather than extraction, knowing that whoever refines rare earths controls the bottleneck. The result is a strategic imbalance where the United States can design the world's most advanced weapons and technologies, yet remains dependent on a rival nation to build them at scale. That dependency is not theoretical. It has already been tested through export restrictions and political signaling. And every time it happens, the message is the same. Supply can be weaponized. Greenland changes that equation because it offers scale, diversification, and proximity all at once. Its deposits are large enough to break pricing power and long enough to sustain production for decades. From a strategic perspective, environmental debates and local politics do not outweigh the risk of allowing an adversary indirect veto power over defense production. When national security depends on uninterrupted access to critical materials, control stops being optional and becomes compulsory. That reality alone pushes Greenland from peripheral interest to strategic necessity. The second layer of Greenland's value emerges when you look beyond minerals and into the geometry of global trade. Climate change is rapidly transforming the Arctic from a frozen barrier into a navigable corridor, and this shift is happening far faster than most people realize. Routes that once existed only on strategic maps are already open for months each year, cutting transit times between Asia and Europe dramatically. Shorter routes mean lower fuel costs, faster delivery cycles, and enormous economic advantages for whoever can secure access and oversight. The problem for the United States is that the most developed Arctic routes today run along coastlines controlled or influenced by strategic competitors. That creates a future where trillions of dollars in trade move through corridors America does not control. Greenland sits directly astride the most important Arctic choke point linking the North Atlantic to these emerging routes. Any vessel moving between the Arctic Ocean and the global economy must pass through waters where Greenland provides surveillance, enforcement, and denial capabilities. Control over that space is not just about tolls or ports, but about leverage. Whoever holds it gains the ability to monitor traffic, shape trade flows, and apply pressure without firing a shot. As Arctic shipping scales, this control becomes as valuable as the world's most famous maritime straits. That alone elevates Greenland from remote territory to strategic linchpin. Military geography is the third factor that turns Greenland from an interest into a requirement. The island sits directly on the shortest path between North America and Eurasia, which means it occupies the most important airspace and sea lanes in any high-end conflict involving nuclear powers. Ballistic missiles do not curve around continents. They take the shortest route, and that route passes over the Arctic and directly across Greenland. This makes Greenland indispensable for early warning systems that provide the narrow window of time needed to detect launches and respond. Minutes matter at that scale, and Greenland's location is the difference between reaction and surprise. Beyond missile defense, the island functions as an unsinkable forward base for Arctic operations. Aircraft, surveillance platforms, and naval assets positioned there can reach across the northern Atlantic, the Arctic Ocean, and deep into northern Eurasia with minimal strain. In any future conflict, the side that controls Greenland controls the northern theater by default. Right now, American access depends on agreements that exist at the discretion of another government. That arrangement is workable in peacetime, but strategic planning cannot rely on goodwill when existential risks are involved. From a defense perspective, sovereignty equals certainty, and certainty is non-negotiable when the stakes involve national survival. China's Arctic strategy is what ties the mineral, shipping, and military pieces into a single, coherent threat picture. Beijing does not need to own territory outright to control outcomes. It prefers influence through capital, infrastructure, and long-term dependency. Under the banner of scientific research and commercial investment, China has been methodically inserting itself into Arctic economies, financing ports, airports, rail links, energy projects, and communication systems that will define how the region functions once traffic explodes. This approach is slow by design, because influence that arrives quietly is harder to remove later. Greenland represents the missing link in this strategy. If Chinese firms secure major mining rights and infrastructure projects there, the Arctic becomes a continuous economic arc running from Scandinavia through Russia and into the North Atlantic, effectively boxing out American freedom of movement. Once that network is built, dislodging it would require immense political and financial cost, if it is possible at all. American planners understand this dynamic from past experience in other regions. The lesson is always the same. Allow strategic infrastructure to fall under rival influence, and military options narrow dramatically. Greenland is not about reacting to Chinese power later. It is about preventing a structure from forming in the first place. When the discussion turns to cost, most analyses immediately miss the point, because they frame Greenland as an expense rather than an investment measured across decades. Strategic assets are not judged by sticker price, but by the leverage they generate over time. Greenland's mineral base alone reshapes supply chains that currently favor rivals, reducing dependence that would otherwise demand far higher military spending to offset. Add Arctic shipping control and the picture expands further, as influence over emerging trade routes translates into economic pressure that can be applied without sanctions or force. Military positioning compounds this value by eliminating the need to replicate Arctic infrastructure elsewhere, saving enormous sums that would otherwise be spent on bases, logistics, and extended deployments. Over a 50-year horizon, these advantages dwarf any upfront financial commitment. Even conservative estimates place the combined value of minerals, trade leverage, and defense savings in the tens of trillions. Against that backdrop, any acquisition or long-term control arrangement costs a fraction of 1% of the benefit. That asymmetry is what drives strategic decisions. Governments routinely spend more than this on conflicts that produce no lasting advantage. In this case, the expenditure locks in security, supply independence, and leverage for generations. From a purely rational standpoint, passing on Greenland would represent one of the most expensive mistakes imaginable. Not because of what it costs today, but because of what it would cost to lose tomorrow. The obstacle standing in the way of this logic is not strategy, but governance. Denmark's approach to Greenland is built around preservation rather than projection, prioritizing environmental caution, political stability, and gradual development over rapid strategic adaptation. That model made sense when the Arctic was frozen and peripheral. It does not make sense in an era where the region is becoming central to global competition. Denmark lacks the capital to develop large-scale infrastructure, the military capacity to secure it against pressure from major powers, and the political appetite to override local resistance when strategic urgency demands speed. From an American perspective, this creates a dangerous vacuum. Strategic spaces do not remain neutral indefinitely. They are either shaped by someone or claimed by default. Every year Greenland remains underdeveloped is a year in which rival powers gain relative advantage, either by consolidating rare earth dominance, expanding Arctic logistics, or deepening regional influence. In that context, maintaining the status quo is not a neutral choice. It is an active strategic loss. For U.S. planners, relying on Denmark to manage an asset of this magnitude is no longer acceptable, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. The gap between what Greenland represents and what its current governance can deliver is widening rapidly, and that gap is what drives intervention. The transition toward American control would not arrive through tanks or ultimatums, but through pressure applied in ways that feel technical rather than coercive. Strategic outcomes in the modern era are shaped through trade relationships, capital flows, investment decisions, and diplomatic leverage long before formal decisions are announced. Economic signals already hint at this direction, as uncertainty around Greenland's future begins to affect partnerships, infrastructure planning, and long-term financing. Denmark carries a continuous financial burden in subsidizing Greenland while gaining little strategic return, and that imbalance becomes harder to justify when external pressure increases. At the same time, American investment capacity dwarfs anything Denmark can realistically offer, creating an alternative path that becomes increasingly attractive to local leadership and the population. The choice is not framed as surrender or annexation, but as development versus stagnation. When one option promises jobs, infrastructure, and long-term security, while the other offers continuity without growth, opinion begins to shift organically. This is how strategic transitions happen in the 21st century. They are negotiated through incentives and inevitability rather than force. Once economic gravity tilts decisively in one direction, political outcomes follow, often presented as democratic choice, even though the range of options has already been shaped by external necessity. At the Greenlandic level, the decision would ultimately revolve around sovereignty, prosperity, and timing. Public opinion there is not anchored to loyalty toward Denmark or enthusiasm for American control, but to uncertainty about the future. Most Greenlanders want self-determination, yet they also understand that independence without a powerful economic partner is unrealistic. This creates an opening where strategic alignment can be reframed as empowerment rather than submission. American involvement would be presented not as annexation, but as partnership, backed by capital, security guarantees, and access to markets that Greenland cannot reach alone. Infrastructure investment becomes the decisive lever because infrastructure changes daily life in ways abstract political debates never do. Ports, airports, communications networks, and energy systems translate directly into jobs, income, and opportunity. Once those offers are concrete and funded, resistance softens, not because identity disappears, but because material reality intervenes. A referendum held under those conditions does not require manipulation to produce a predictable result. When one path offers rapid development and strategic relevance, and the other offers slow drift and continued dependence, voters make rational choices. From the outside, the outcome looks democratic. From a strategic lens, it looks inevitable. Once Greenland's internal decision aligns with American strategic interests, the remaining step becomes formalization, and this is where diplomacy replaces ambiguity. Denmark would be forced into a narrow corridor of choices, none of which preserve the status quo. Blocking a clear expression of Greenlandic self-determination would invite international backlash and revive accusations of colonial control that modern European governments work hard to avoid. Accepting the outcome, however, opens the door to negotiation rather than loss. In that scenario, Denmark is compensated financially and politically, framing the transition as a responsible resolution rather than a defeat. For the United States, this approach secures long-term strategic control without undermining alliances or setting a precedent of coercion. Every party involved can claim a version of victory. Denmark respects democratic process, Greenland gains prosperity and relevance, and America locks in a critical asset. Behind the diplomatic language, the driving force remains unchanged. Strategic necessity dictates outcomes long before treaties are signed. Once the balance of incentives tilts far enough, formal agreements merely record decisions that have already been made in practice. At that point, labels such as territory, commonwealth, or association matter far less than the reality on the ground, where infrastructure, security, and policy direction are aligned with American priorities. Viewed as a whole, the trajectory becomes difficult to deny because it is driven by constraints rather than ambition. Great powers can tolerate inefficiency, but they cannot tolerate structural vulnerability, especially when it involves critical resources, strategic geography, and future trade routes. Greenland sits at the intersection of all three, and that intersection grows more valuable with every passing year. Delay does not preserve neutrality. It redistributes advantage to rivals who are already positioning themselves for the Arctic's opening. From Washington's perspective, allowing that to continue would mean accepting long-term dependence and diminished leverage, outcomes no serious strategic planner can endorse. This is why the timeline feels compressed and the logic feels relentless. The mechanisms are already visible, the incentives are already aligned, and the alternatives are steadily disappearing. Whether the final arrangement is described as ownership, association, or partnership is largely cosmetic. What matters is control over decisions that shape minerals, shipping, and military access. When those decisions are centralized, the strategic outcome is secured. History shows that when necessity reaches this level, outcomes follow quietly but decisively. Greenland's future will not be determined by public debate alone, but by the arithmetic of power that leaves fewer options each year. The only real uncertainty is not whether control shifts, but how quickly the transition completes and how softly it is presented to the world. This is why Greenland should not be viewed as a diplomatic curiosity or a controversial soundbite, but as a case study in how power actually moves in the modern world. Strategic outcomes are rarely announced in advance. They emerge when geography, resources, and timing converge so tightly that alternatives disappear. By the time the public conversation catches up, the decision has already been made in practice. Greenland represents that moment. Rare earth independence, Arctic trade leverage, missile defense certainty, and Chinese containment are not abstract goals. They are requirements for maintaining influence in the decades ahead. When a superpower faces a structural vulnerability of this scale, it does not debate indefinitely. It resolves it. The form that resolution takes may be polite, legal, and wrapped in cooperative language, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Control follows necessity. If you want to understand geopolitics before it becomes obvious, you have to stop listening to surface narratives and start watching where incentives align and constraints tighten. That is where the real story is written. If this analysis reshaped how you see Greenland and Arctic strategy, pay attention to what follows next, because this is not an isolated case. The same logic is unfolding in energy, technology, and global finance. Those who recognize it early are never surprised by outcomes. Those who don't are left wondering how the map changed while they were still arguing about whether it could.